What's up, guys? Welcome back to the Home Slice again. Once again, I was not planning on doing any videos this weekend, but I've seen more and more people who are testing out the new CPM MagnaCut. And as I've been watching this, I realized that I want to kind of add my voice to the voices that are out there, because oftentimes I'll see somebody and they'll explain what it does, and they'll show and they'll say how cool it is. And they'll be like, and it's awesome because, well, it's kind of complicated. And I think one of my particular interests is decomplicating the process of understanding what's going on with metallurgy as much as we can. And I wanted to make a quick video to both cut down on the sort of misinformation or mythology that could go on, but also to give you some groundwork for understanding why this is such a cool development in the steel world. So I'm just going to nerd out and talk to you about steel for the next who knows how long. If that's your thing, buckle up. Here we go. So there's basically three traits to steel. Most of my viewers, you'll be totally familiar with this, but just be patient with me while we get everybody else up to speed. There's toughness. Toughness is the ability of a steel to not break under a load. It's measured by a machine called a Charpy toughness tester, and they take a plate of the steel or whatever material is being tested, and they hollow out a little C-shaped or V-shaped notch in it so that it has a weak point down it. And then a hammer drops through, boom, and the plate of steel is up against two devices which measure the amount of force that it took before it broke. So this gives us a rough idea of how much load or how much pressure or force a piece of steel at a given thickness could endure before breaking. If you want to see a lot of stats on that and some really helpful stuff, go to knifesteelnerds.com. If you look up Charpy, C-H-A-R-P-Y, you'll find a bunch of testing that Larrin has done on that, which is really helpful. The next thing is wear resistance. Now, the more carbon and alloys that you add to a steel, it forms hard chunks called carbides, and these help the edge not be worn away. It should be noted that toughness, which I just talked about, lends itself to edge stability. And edge stability is the ability of the edge to hold its shape and not be bent or broken out of shape. This is different from wear resistance. Wear resistance is essentially most of the things that you cut have some abrasive character to them. So if you cut up cardboard or rope, they're actually wearing away bits of steel. And those carbide chunks, where the carbon binds with other alloys in the steel, they actually create these hard spots that are more difficult to wear away than the rest of it. The last attribute of steel is corrosion resistance. And most of you could think of this as stainlessness, or the ability to resist rusting or forming some kind of unhelpful patina. Now, it's always been a balance with knives. Like, you often have had to give up one of those three characteristics to gain the other two. It's sort of an age-old problem. And why, you may ask. Well, two of the basic reasons, I guess, is that in order to get more wear resistance, you need to increase the amount of carbon and other alloys and create more, like harder steel and more pieces of carbide in it. But every time you do that, it drops in toughness. A common metaphor that's really limited is a slab of concrete that's got rocks in it. And the concrete mix itself is where the strength lies, right? Just like the steel solution itself is where the strength lies, or the steel matrix, they sometimes say. But if you were to wear away at it, some of those rocks would stay in place longer than the cement. And that's a sort of a vague picture that's helpful, although not entirely accurate, because the adhesion is different between carbides and steel, as Todd Simpson has recently shown. And because the difference in hardness is maybe not as direct or not as vast, but it's a helpful picture. In order to get more rust resistance or corrosion resistance, you need to increase the amount of chrome that's in the steel. But every time that you increase the amount of chrome that's in the steel, you usually, beyond a certain threshold, also end up with a drop in toughness. And so you have this debacle. Both increasing the amount of chrome or the amount of rust resistance, or increasing the carbon and the alloys, or increasing the wear resistance essentially, both of those things drop the toughness of the steel. So you lose edge stability to gain an edge that can't be worn away easily. You lose a steel that is difficult to break when you add a bunch of stainlessness to it throughout times in the past. There are some exceptions to that. If you want to know about that, check out my shorts on the history of steel development. That'll help you out there. So there's two big reasons that are kind of under the hood in your steel, so to speak, and sort of hidden factors that affect why this is. Why, like in the history of steel development, it's often been true that you have to give up one of the attributes to gain the other two. One of them is grain structure. If you were to look at a micrograph of steel, I've just drawn kind of a silly one here. You would see steel, which is represented by this gray area, and then you would see a grain structure, which at least they filter the image a certain way, and you can see a grain structure in micrographs. And the grain structure would be these edges of the steel crystals, which are bonded to each other, that run between carbides oftentimes. You would also see these white patches are representative of carbide. I know this is really crude, but this is a generalization. So when you add chrome and other alloys, it changes the arrangement of the carbon and iron atoms that are essential to steel. And that change in arrangement often makes them sort into different grain structures. And different grain structures have different properties. So just adding beyond a certain amount of chrome to a steel, oftentimes you'll see a slight dip in the toughness. It's one of the reasons why a steel like 3V is quite tough, but a steel like 5160 will be even tougher because there are changes that are hard to avoid. Now, the grain structure changes can be affected by heat treat, can be somewhat changed by heat treat, and it's a pretty minimal change. The biggest thing that is causing you to lose toughness is carbides. It's filling that concrete full of rocks, so to speak. One thing that's been especially unhelpful in the steel world is that you need chrome. You need chrome to make the steel resist rust. But you get beyond a certain amount of chrome and it starts to want to bond with the carbon alone rather than the steel. And it will start to form these large and relatively soft and unhelpful chromium carbides. Chromium carbides are unhelpful for several reasons. One of the reasons is they're not particularly durable. Another reason is that they are particularly large, at least most alloy combinations that they combine with. And so if you've got one in your edge, you've got a large, not super hard, not super tough section of edge there. Another reason that they're particularly unhelpful is that if this guy here is a chromium carbide, then once it forms, it will begin to suck in chrome from all the steel surrounding it, and it will actually rob chrome out of the steel solution or the steel matrix, which will actually then drop. You're adding chrome to make it more rust resistant, but as it begins to form carbides, those carbides actually have a localized drop in rust resistance, so it counteracts its own positive effect, if that makes sense. So in the past, this was especially problematic because they often didn't have processes by which they could control how much of the chrome went into carbides and how much of it went into the steel matrix. So to get a steel to resist rust more, you needed to add more and more and more chrome, but some of that was unhelpful to all three of these characteristics that you want in a good cutlery steel. For a steel to be considered sort of stainless, you need about 10 to 13% of the chrome that's in it to stay in the steel and not to go in to the carbides. The chrome actually helps the steel resist rusting by making what's called a passivation layer, or it basically, there's enough of the chrome in the steel that the chrome itself actually creates a barrier to the rust forming with the iron, if that makes sense. So to give sort of an example, if you think of this bar as being sort of the total amount of chrome that's in CPM S30V steel. It has 14% chrome overall, and depending on your heat treat, maybe 12 or 13% of that is going into the steel matrix to make it a relatively stainless steel. And if you've used S30V, you know it doesn't rust unduly quickly or have poor corrosion resistance. But to get that effect, they added 14% total. And so the extra 2% is actually counteracting your toughness, counteracting your rust resistance, and not helping that much with your wear resistance either. So your options in the past have been sort of like to cut a bunch of chromium out of the mix so that that small amount of chromium that's left, it wants to stay in the solution or in the matrix. And that's what they've done with steels like CPM 3V. It's got like 7.5% chrome overall, but a large amount of that, I don't even know how much, but a large amount of that is going to stay in the steel matrix to help with rust resistance, and a very small amount of that is going to be getting converted to carbide and thereby decreasing toughness. And that's why if you look actually at Charpy tests of S30V steel versus that of a steel like 3V, in Larrin Thomas's testing, the spillover of the chromium into carbides, among a few other factors, has brought at about 60.5 Rockwell hardness, it's brought the toughness of S30V down to about 6 foot-pounds of pressure to break it on that Charpy toughness tester. Versus when he tested 3V, at the exact same Rockwell hardness, CPM 3V, it takes 34 pounds of pressure. So these have been your sort of two options up until now. Do you go with a steel that cuts the chromium and sort of has a reduced capacity to resist rust because you want it to be both wear resistant to some extent and also have great toughness? Or do you need it to be stainless, in which case you're going to have to give up some of the toughness in order to accomplish that? It's been very difficult to get all three of these attributes to a very high level in steel. Larrin Thomas on knifenerds.com has written articles about how S35VN has been a stainless steel that has had some combination of them, but even so, it's nowhere near the toughness. Like the Charpy toughness, I believe, for that is somewhere in the 12 foot-pounds of pressure range, or 10 at about 60.5 Rockwell. So obviously nowhere near the level that you're seeing with CPM 3V, but an improvement in his testing over S30V. So that brings us to MagnaCut. So Larrin asked this very important question, and the question was this: what if there was absolutely no spillover into carbides with your chrome? What if every bit of chromium that you put into the steel, every last bit, went into the steel matrix? So you had a steel which had the optimal toughness for that level of chrome, which also didn't have something competing with the vanadium carbides. So the chrome actually competes with vanadium carbides and pulls carbon away from them and makes them less useful. And it forms carbides which are much softer and they don't add to wear resistance as much. So this is the question. Now, if you have too little carbon in the solution of the steel, then it limits the amount that you can actually harden the steel. And so Larrin sort of set out to get this perfect balance between, so far as he could, between carbon and chromium. And with his thermocalc computer software, he started just plugging numbers in. What if we did this sort of recipe of steel? What if we did this? And he started sort of rounding things down, and he decided, hey, I want to put around 4% vanadium into it and a little bit of niobium, and I'll get into that in a second. And then we could have this excellent amount of wear-resistant carbide in it. We could have a steel which is, if not entirely stainless, then nearly entirely stainless. I'll get into that as well in a second. And is still relatively tough. And so in his testing, and I encourage you to read his full article if this interests you. I'll put a link first thing in the description to Larrin's article about how he designed the steel. But in his testing, he pretty well nailed it, closer than any steel that I know of. So the Charpy toughness is about 18 to 20, I believe, foot-pounds of pressure it takes to break it at 60.5 Rockwell, which is pretty insane for a high-carbon stainless steel. It's actually really insane for a high-carbon stainless steel. The wear resistance is excellent because you've got all the vanadium that went into it, or nearly all of it, is making these beautiful, tiny vanadium carbides. It purportedly is not that hard to sharpen because the carbides are so small, and the toughness and everything lends itself to ductility and grindability, and it's got this beautiful combination. And as a bonus, like the chromium with the recipe that he came up with, so thoroughly stayed in solution that actually it prevented almost any chromium carbides from forming, which means that the rust resistance is amazing. Like in the tests that I've seen, it competes with like M390, which is one of the most stainless steels that I've ever used, excluding austenite like H1 or LC200N, which is purpose-built to not rust. A couple other cool things that are really neat about the recipe is that he included some niobium. Now, to understand why that's cool, you need to sort of understand the difference between melted, like ingot steel, and sintered powder steel. So sintered. So powdered steels are made by sintering. It's not a steel that was melted and poured or cast or anything like that. It's a steel that was melted really consistently and then sprayed through a nozzle. The nozzle formed it into teeny tiny little BBs, kind of, and it spread the composition of all of the elements out evenly. And then when they had this sort of collection of little metal BBs, they heated up to a certain temperature, and just like in a Damascus steel, you get it to the right temperature where it's kind of glowing orange, and then the smith takes his hammer and smacks it, and he creates a localized area of high pressure, and it forge welds to each other. Well, it's never liquid, it's just hot enough to be welded together. And powdered metallurgy steel is the same process is going on. So it's getting heated up to a temperature with these teeny tiny little bits of elements to make carbides, and then they put this extremely high pressure and they essentially forge weld it all together. But because it was never a liquid, the elements in the steel don't spread out. They spread out very minimally. One problem that can occur is that if there's neighboring vanadium elements, they can sort of join together into a larger clump of a vanadium carbide, and it's ideal if the carbides are really small. So Larrin included some niobium because niobium actually forms carbides first, makes fairly helpful wear-resistant small carbides, but it also does that all around the vanadium, so the vanadium is blocked from spreading before it precipitates or it hardens. It's blocked from spreading to other pieces of the powdered metal, if that makes sense. Another thing that's cool is he added some nitrogen to it. Nitrogen tends to bond with extra chromium before carbon does. So there's sort of this thing that happens where the nitrogen kind of soaks up any of the chromium that might possibly come out of the steel solution so that it's not around to make those unhelpful chromium carbides and drop the rust resistance and the other properties that you want. That's why I think CPM MagnaCut is really cool. That's why I'm really excited about it. Now, it should be noted that if it's hardened to only like 55 HRC or poorly heat treated, it's still not going to be a miracle steel. But it's really cool to note that it can be, as a stainless steel, hardened up to like 65.5 Rockwell. and it still Sharpie tests better than like S30V. It's insane, guys. It's gonna be so good. I'm not gonna have the budget to like test it forever, but that's okay. It's gonna be like the carrot at the end of my testing stick, you know, to use a like donkey plodding along sort of metaphor. Anyway, I'm sure this has gotten fairly long, but if you're still here, I want to tell you a story because it's really funny how I perceived the coming out of CPM MagnaCut. And what happened to me is I had read a bunch of Larrin's research, and I'm looking at all these graphs, and I'm like, wait a second, if that stainless, like AEBL, you know, if that's super tough, and this one's super, like, weak, then why don't we have something right in the middle? Because that's the steel that I want. So I started looking into crewware and stuff like that, and I thought it was awesome, but this thought occurred to me. I was like, man, if I was ever to make a steel recipe, I would just like add a couple % of chrome to crewware and then put like a bunch of vanadium in it or something like that. And as I thought over it in my mind, I was like, oh, like I think about 1% carbon and about 10% chrome is like what I would do. And then probably a little bit of molybdenum, a bunch of vanadium, a bit of niobium and nitrogen, because I knew these dynamics that happen. And it was so funny because Larrin came out with MagnaCut, and literally my first response was like, no, because I was like, I wanted to do that, which admittedly is really silly. Like, stay tuned because I'm not saying that that's accurate. I think that as I read the article where he talks about developing, I realized that he's been doing steel research and talking to metallurgists since he was like a teenager. He like has dreamed about like impacting the knife world or developing a better stainless steel. He took this huge risk investment and like made his own batch of steel with like nobody on board. Like all of the risk was on his shoulders, and if it failed, it was like all on him. And he talked Crucible into making a test batch of it just for him personally, and then he sent it off to all these knife makers, and he didn't know. Like, yet he talks about having all these sleepless nights wondering, like, is there enough silicon, and is there enough of this or that? And so what's really cool, as the situation has unfolded, I've realized that I actually only knew that that was like a bit of a hole in the available steels that we have because of Larrin's research. Like, I never would have known that had he not done all this testing. And what's also cool is that somebody made my steel, but they made it better than I ever would have. Like, I don't understand all the interactions between all the elements. Anyway, I just would invite all of you to check it out as you can. Please read this article. If like this is like a layman's terms sort of basic steel knowledge overview, but if this interests you, read Larrin's research yourself. It'll blow your mind. It's so cool that it worked. Like, it was like a big experiment that now we all get to benefit from. So the place where I'm landing is like not this like, oh, I wish I could have developed that, but it's instead like, hey, like somebody made the steel that I've always wanted to exist. I didn't even realize it would be fully stainless, which is mind-boggling and so cool. And the idea that I had this faint inkling of is actually a really good and really cool idea. You see Big Brown Bear hammering through nails and all of these crazy tests, and the DBK boys like smashing that frying pan. It's like not even dull. It's so crazy. So anyway, check out MagnaCut. That's my overview of it. If you have other questions, throw them in the comments. I'm really, really excited about it. I think that it's going to be absolutely the best balance of grain structure, carbides, of wear resistance, toughness, and rust resistance that we've ever seen, and that there'll be some companies that are able to do some really amazing things with it. Anyway, I hope you guys are doing well. I'll actually sign off for now. Thanks for tuning into these sort of less edited, less polished videos, and I'll just say, hey, peace out from the home slice.